Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine the chill of late November 1943. The skies above Bremen shimmer with the pale light of a northern dawn, and beneath them, engines still tick with heat as Major Francis Gabby Gabreski leans over his logbook. His pencil trembles just slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of what had just unfolded. He writes down a sentence that only 8 months earlier would have seemed almost laughable. The RAF veterans had scoffed, "That monstrous Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, it'll never survive against the Luftwaffe's sleek killers." And yet, on this frozen morning, the Luftwaffe had learned something new and terrifying. Picture it. Through the ice-rimmed canopy at 28,000 feet, Gabreski watched his squadron dive in a way that broke every established rule of aerial combat since the days of the Great War. Instead of turning in graceful horizontal circles to dogfight, the American pilots flipped their massive aircraft upside down and plunged vertically toward the earth. The altimeter spun wildly, and the airspeed needle screamed toward 500 miles per hour, a speed that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. Below them, German Messerschmitt Bf-110s were climbing confidently toward the vulnerable Boeing B-17s until death itself came roaring out of the sun. 8 Browning .50 caliber guns spat fire as the Thunderbolt struck, descending like the wrath of Zeus. In seconds, what had been the hunters became the hunted. From that day forward, the rules of air supremacy would never again be measured in turning circles or climb rates. They would be written in raw physics, in the terrifying descent of a 4-ton machine hurtling toward terminal velocity, only to use that same momentum to rocket skyward again. Turbochargers screaming in the thin air. There, at high altitude, American pilots found a realm where the Luftwaffe could not follow. That day, Gabreski downed 2 Bf-110s with this revolutionary tactic, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for saving the bomber stream. But this moment of triumph had roots stretching back to the spring, April 13, 1943, when the 56th Fighter Group flew its very first combat mission, a fighter sweep over Saint-Omer in occupied France. The atmosphere in those early days was thick with doubt. The men had trained for 8 months on the Thunderbolt, yet uncertainty gnawed at them. Could such a heavy beast truly fight? Fully loaded, it weighed nearly $14,000 and up to $7,500 with external tanks and bombs. It outweighed the elegant Spitfire by $4,000 and the deadly Focke-Wulf FW-109 by $3,000. Critics mocked it mercilessly. A flying milk bottle, they said, or simply the jug. Even among its own pilots, confidence was fragile. Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson, fresh from flight school, admitted years later that he was convinced he wouldn't survive his first week. His later memoirs, written with Martin Caden, would reveal the profound transformation that followed, how doubt turned to awe and awe to mastery. The roots of that transformation began far from the battlefield, in a factory at Farmingdale, Long Island. There, a Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli, known for both his genius and his dry wit, had designed something no one else dared imagine. When his earlier project, the XP-44, was abruptly canceled, Kartveli reportedly sketched out the new concept right on a train. He later joked that his creation was a dinosaur, but, as he put it with a smile, a dinosaur with good proportions. And on that frigid November morning over Bremen, the world saw just how right he was. Picture this, a machine so immense, so unapologetically powerful, that it seemed less an aircraft than a controlled explosion wrapped in metal. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed around an engine, it was an engine with wings attached. At its heart roared the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a masterpiece of American engineering, 18 cylinders in 2 perfect rows, producing 2,000 horsepower at sea level. And when water injection kicked in, its secret weapon for desperate moments in combat, that power surged to 2,300 horsepower. Later variants, such as the P-47M, would climb even higher, touching an almost mythic 2,800 horsepower. Few piston engine fighters in history would ever rival such ferocity. But this power was only half the secret. Hidden deep within the Thunderbolt's massive fuselage lay its soul, a labyrinthine turbo supercharger system that made the impossible possible. Imagine the exhaust gases, still searing hot, channeled along both sides of the cockpit through shining ducts to a General Electric turbine spinning 21,300 revolutions per minute beneath the aircraft's belly. That turbine, howling like a caged storm, compressed incoming air, cooled it through an intercooler and sent it back into the engine, denser, richer, hungrier. The result? A revolution in high-altitude warfare. While German fighters gasped thin air above 27,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's R-2800 breathed like a predator. At 30,000 feet, where most aircraft struggled merely to stay aloft, the P-47 was still surging forward, faster and stronger than anything the Luftwaffe could field. And it could climb higher still, up to 42,000 feet, into a realm where the sky thinned into silver and enemy pilots could do little but watch their instruments falter. Yet all that marvel came at a cost. Strength and protection weighed heavy. The P-47's turbocharger, its armor plating thick enough to stop cannon shells, the 69-pound armored headrest, self-sealing tanks holding 370 gallons of fuel, and 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns with 425 rounds apiece, all of it, added up to a colossus. Empty, it weighed over 9,900 pounds. Fully armed for combat, more than 14,000. To some, it was madness. How could a monster like this ever dance with the Luftwaffe's nimble aces? Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, riding home after his first mission on April 13, 1943, captured that sense of unease. The Germans have been fighting for years. We're stepping into their world with a plane many say is the wrong tool for the job. But Colonel Zemke believes we'll find our way. And so they learned, slowly, methodically. Through late April and May 1943, the missions were tentative. Cautious fighter sweeps over the French coast, feeling out the landscape, mastering the aircraft, testing the equipment, avoiding the kind of overconfidence that could doom a fledgling unit. Then came the turning point, June 12, 1943, RAF mission Rodeo 204 over the Belgian coast. Captain Walter V. Cook of the 61st Fighter Squadron spotted a lone Focke-Wulf FW-190 glinting below near Blankenberg. Remembering Colonel Hubert Zemke's Golden Rule attack from altitude, Cook rolled over, dove like a fallen star, and unleashed the 8 guns. The German fighter disintegrated in smoke and flame. It was the 56th Fighter Group's first confirmed kill and the birth of a new doctrine, the deadly dive. The very next day, June 13th, brought 3 more victories. Lieutenant Robert Johnson claimed his first. Diving from altitude over Bergues, France, he struck with precision, watching the FW-190 spiral into the earth. When he returned, Major General Carl Spaatz himself greeted him with a bottle of Scotch whiskey and old fighter pilot salute to one of the first P-47 victories of the 8th Air Force. But a triumph came with a lesson in blood and humility. During that same mission, Johnson's element leader failed to follow him down, leaving him isolated amid swarming enemy fighters. Though he survived and was commended for his kill, he was also sternly reprimanded by Zemke, Gabreski, and Captain Gerald W. Johnson. The message was clear. Individual heroics were meaningless without discipline. The dive worked only when every pilot covered the others. In the chaos of air combat, teamwork was life. Still, the men of the 56th had only begun to glimpse what their aircraft could truly do. Months before they ever saw European skies, on November 13, 1942, two test pilots, Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer, had already pushed the P-47C to its edge. From 35,000 feet over the United States, they nosed their Thunderbolts down into near vertical dives, chasing the unknown. What they discovered next would defy every limit ever written about flight. What happened next would redefine everything the engineers and the pilots themselves believed possible. As Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer pushed their P-47C Thunderbolts into those near vertical dives, the numbers on their instrument began to blur. The airspeed indicators surged past 500 miles per hour, then 600, then almost unbelievably 725 mph indicated airspeed. In reality, their true speed was likely closer to 550 or 600 mph, since at such extremes of altitude and velocity, the pitot static systems could no longer be trusted. But at that moment, they were venturing into a realm no propeller-driven aircraft had ever dared to enter. Republic Aviation's publicists soon made an audacious claim that Comstock and Dyer had broken the sound barrier, becoming the first humans in history to do so. The story electrified the press and alarmed the U.S. Army Air Forces. General Henry Hap Arnold himself sent a terse telegram to Republic. There will be no further discussion of this dive. The truth, as post-war research would confirm, was less sensational, but no less extraordinary. Later tests showed that the highest verified speed achieved by any World War II propeller aircraft was around Mach 009, reached by a specially modified Supermarine Spitfire. The P-47s had not quite crossed that invisible frontier, but they had brushed terrifyingly close to it. What Comstock and Dyer discovered that day would save countless lives in the years to come. Beyond roughly 550 miles per hour, they entered the strange twilight world of compressibility, a phenomenon little understood at the time. Airflow over the P-47's wings began to approach the speed of sound, forming shock waves that pinned the control surfaces in place. The stick froze solid. No matter how they pulled, the aircraft refused to respond. They were trapped in a howling vertical fall, accelerating faster and faster, their bodies crushed into the seats by brutal G-forces, their vision narrowing into gray tunnels. Imagine the terror. The altimeter spinning down, the ground racing upward, the controls dead in their hands. Yet somehow, through instinct and sheer determination, both men managed to survive. When they landed drenched in sweat, trembling but alive, they had uncovered the secret that would become gospel for every Thunderbolt pilot thereafter. The recovery technique, later codified by combat veterans such as Charles D. Maul, was deceptively simple, but demanded absolute control. When the stick froze, the pilot was to press forward firmly with both hands, keeping the trim tab strictly neutral. Under no circumstances were they to touch the trim wheel doing so could send the aircraft into catastrophic overcontrol once it descended into denser air. Instead, the pilot would maintain steady back pressure, neither jerking nor fighting the controls, holding that tension while the Thunderbolt sliced downward through the compressibility zone. Below about 15,000 feet, the miracle would begin. The air thickened, the pressure over the wings normalized, and the stick would slowly come alive again under the pilot's hands. The massive fighter would respond, arching upward in a bone-crushing pullout that slammed its pilot into the seat with forces of 7 or 8 Gs. Both Comstock and Dyer emerged from their dives with barely 2,000 feet of sky left between them and the ground. Their bodies ached, their nerves were frayed, but they had proven something vital. When they reported their experiences to the engineers at Republic and Wright Field, the response was immediate and decisive. Every future P-47 pilot would be trained to recognize the onset of compressibility and to recover from it correctly. And in the process, the engineers realized something astonishing. The same thick wing that critics had derided for making the P-47 sluggish in turns actually saved the aircraft in a dive. It delayed the onset of critical compressibility, allowing the Thunderbolt to plunge faster, deeper, and recover more safely than any other fighter of its era. In the thin, freezing air between life and death, the Jug had revealed its final secret. It was not just powerful, it was indestructible. By mid-1943, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved yet again. Later, D models were fitted with a new feature that would turn a deadly flaw into a battlefield advantage. Dive recovery flaps, these small, sturdy panels, when deployed during high-speed dives, tamed the beast of compressibility, giving pilots the control they needed to pull out safely. It was a seemingly minor change, but in the furious, high-altitude duels of Europe, it would prove decisive. Throughout May and June 1943, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke drilled his men mercilessly. Day after day, he reshaped the instincts of his pilots, hammering home a single idea. The P-47 was not a dogfighter in the old sense. It was a predator, built for the vertical arena. "Climb first," he insisted, "then strike from above." And so they climbed to 30,000 feet and higher before entering enemy airspace. Formation discipline was sacred. Spacing, communication, mutual support. No heroics. Never chase an enemy down to the deck, where the Thunderbolt's bulk became a liability and its climb advantage was lost. When enemy aircraft appeared below, the sequence was pure precision. Roll inverted to keep the target in view. Pull through with 4 to 5 Gs until the nose points earthward. Shove the throttle forward, full power. The Thunderbolt plunged like an avalanche. Within seconds, it was hurtling downward at over 480 miles per hour, sometimes surpassing 500. For a German pilot, there was almost no time to react, and then came the storm. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, each cycling nearly 800 rounds a minute, unleashed a combined fury of over 6,000 rounds per minute. That's more than 100 bullets every second, tearing through the air with unstoppable momentum. A 2-second burst was often enough to reduce a fighter to scrap metal. Before the stunned enemy could even blink, the P-47 would pull back hard on the stick, trading its kinetic energy for altitude in a breathtaking zoom climb. Within less than a minute, the American pilot was back where he belonged, high above, untouchable once more. Still, many doubted. Could such tactics truly win wars? Some of the younger pilots, steeped in the old dogfighting traditions, bristled at the idea of diving attacks. "Running away in a dive isn't fighting," they muttered. Zemka disagreed. "It's surviving," he told them, "and making sure the other man doesn't." That truth was seared into memory on June 26, 1943. 48 P-47Cs of the 56th Fighter Group were escorting B-17 bombers returning from Villers-Coublay, France, when 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Yankishwara 26 struck near Forges-les-Eaux. The fight that followed would cost lives and teach hard lessons. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying his P-47C half-pint, was hit almost immediately. Cannon shells ripped through his aircraft. The canopy exploded in shards. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his windscreen like blood. A brief flash of fire erupted behind the cockpit. Shrapnel sliced his face, numbing his nose, blurring his vision. Most men would have bailed out, but the canopy was jammed. Johnson was trapped inside a dying machine. He shoved the nose down and dove for the English Channel, throttle wide open. Behind him, a lone FW-190 gave chase, hammering away with 20mm cannon fire. More shells tore through his wings, his fuselage, his very cockpit. Somehow, the Thunderbolt held together. When the German finally ran out of ammunition, he pulled alongside the stricken American, saluted, and broke away. Was it respect? Pity? Johnson never knew, but his engine, the mighty Pratt & Whitney R-2800, kept roaring. The airframe, riddled with holes large enough to pass a fist through, refused to surrender. Johnson nursed the shattered half-pint across the channel, miraculously found RAF Manston, and brought her in for a perfect landing, with almost no forward visibility. When ground crews inspected the aircraft, they counted over 200 bullet and cannon holes without even circling it. Hydraulic systems were shredded, the right wing nearly severed, yet the plane had done its duty. Johnson walked away with only minor injuries, and the Thunderbolt, astonishingly, was later repaired and returned to service. That same mission cost the 56th Fighter Group 4 aircraft and 4 brave men, their heaviest single-day loss so far. But it also proved something extraordinary. The P-47 was no fragile speedster. It was a fortress, built to absorb punishment. It brought its pilots home when nothing else could. Then came the ultimate test, August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. The 8th Air Force launched 376 heavy bombers on a double strike deep inside Germany. Ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft production facilities at Regensburg. The bombers would fly far beyond the protective umbrella of Allied fighters. For part of that journey, their lives depended on one thing: the 56th Fighter Group. Major Francis Gabby Gabreski, leading the 61st Fighter Squadron, positioned his men 5,000 feet above the bomber stream at 30,000 feet. Below them, the silver formations of B-17s stretched across the sky like a gleaming river of steel. The enemy was waiting, but so were the Thunderbolts, poised to dive like hawks from the heavens. August 17, 1943, high above the heart of occupied Europe. The bombers of the 8th Air Force droned steadily eastward, their contrails carving white scars across the sky. Below, in the haze over northern France and Belgium, the Luftwaffe was rising to meet them. Roughly 40 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s clawing their way upward from scattered airfields, perfectly timing their intercept to strike when the American escorts would be nearing the edge of their fuel range. But what the German pilots did not expect was the storm descending from above. From 30,000 feet, the 56th Fighter Group moved as one. dozens of P-47 Thunderbolts rolled inverted almost simultaneously, their silver wings catching the sunlight for a heartbeat before they dropped their noses between 45 and 60 degrees. Then came the dive, the sky filled with the scream of air tearing past at unimaginable speed, 480, 500 miles per hour, faster than any German pilot had ever seen an American fighter move. The engagement stretched across 70 miles of Belgian and German airspace and lasted barely 20 minutes. But within that short time, the heavens became a battlefield of thunder and flame. The Thunderbolts struck with ruthless precision, diving, firing, and then clawing back to altitude in disciplined waves. It was air combat reduced to physics, kinetic, brutal, efficient. By the time the last contrails drifted apart, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 16 enemy aircraft destroyed, 9 damaged, and 1 probable, at the cost of 3 Thunderbolts. German records later confirmed 22 aircraft lost across all units that day, with 11 pilots killed and 8 wounded. Among the dead was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, commander of the 2nd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, and younger brother of the famed General Adolf Galland. Galland, a veteran with 55 victories to his name, had fallen to tactics he had never been trained to fight. The kill was credited to Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who had dived from altitude at over 480 miles per hour and unleashed a concentrated burst from his 850 caliber guns. The torrent of fire tore Galland's FW-190 apart midair. 2 months later, recovery crews would find the wreckage driven 12 feet into the ground, Galland's body still strapped in his seat. The psychological shock was immense. One of the Luftwaffe's most respected aces had been annihilated by a tactic that left no room for defense. For the German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26, the skies over France no longer belonged to them. Yet beyond the personal tragedies and victories, there was a larger truth unfolding. The bombers had survived. During the period of P-47 escort, the losses among the B-17 formations were far lower than anticipated. The Thunderbolts had achieved what truly mattered. They had kept the bombers alive long enough to continue dismantling Germany's industrial might. Kill ratios were secondary. Preservation of the bomber stream was the true measure of success. By October 1943, the doctrine that Zemke and his men had forged through blood and fire had reached full maturity. The 56th Fighter Group now executed diving attacks with the precision of a machine. The results were astonishing. Kill ratios once thought impossible only 6 months earlier. On October 4th, 1943, during an escort mission to Frankfurt, the group encountered roughly 60 German fighters attempting to break into the bomber stream near Cologne. The Thunderbolts, perfectly positioned above their prey, rolled into their dives. When the battle ended, the 56th claimed 16 enemy aircraft destroyed, most of them twin-engine Bf-110s, for the loss of only 2 Thunderbolts, both to flak rather than enemy fighters. Just 4 days later, on October 8th, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson once again demonstrated the art of the boom and zoom. Flying as wingman to Captain Gerald W. Johnson, he spotted a Focke-Wulf FW-190 closing unseen on another Thunderbolt. From 29,000 feet, he rolled inverted, pulled through 4 Gs, and dropped his nose toward the German fighter. At 26,000 feet and 460 miles per hour, he fired. 8 streams of 50 caliber fire converged in a storm of destruction. Pieces of the FW-190 spiraled away as the aircraft flipped over and plunged toward the earth. Johnson climbed back to 29,000 feet in less than a minute, regaining his position as though nothing had happened. The entire attack, from roll-in to recovery, lasted barely 50 seconds. It was boom and zoom warfare in its purest form. Then came October 10th, 1943, over Münster, the day Robert S. Johnson became an ace. His squadron intercepted about 40 German fighters that were pouncing on withdrawing B-17s. For 25 minutes, the sky was chaos, tracers, vapor trails, and the scream of engines. Johnson executed 3 perfect diving attacks in rapid succession, destroying 1 Messerschmitt Bf-109, 1 twin-engine Bf-110, and 1 FW-190 Escort. By the end of the engagement, his total stood at 5 confirmed victories. He had joined the ranks of the aces. What Johnson did not yet know was that one of his victims that day was none other than Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, a legend of the Luftwaffe, credited with 206 victories, including 177 on the Eastern Front and 29 in the West. Philipp, one of Germany's finest, had fallen to the relentless precision of the Thunderbolt's new way of war. By autumn 1943, the message was unmistakable. The era of the turning dogfight was over. The age of the dive, the age of the Thunderbolt, had arrived. By the autumn of 1943, Robert S. Johnson had already earned his reputation as one of the most aggressive and determined pilots in the 8th Air Force. But his ferocity in combat nearly cost him his life. During that fateful October 10th mission over Münster, Johnson's final attack came at tremendous risk. Pressing his dive against a twin-engine Bf-110, he closed to lethal range and fired. But the German gunner returned fire before the P-47 could pass. Explosive 20mm cannon shells ripped through Johnson's right wing and fuselage. Hydraulic lines burst. Fluid streamed across his canopy, and the controls grew heavy and sluggish. Smoke began to trail behind his Thunderbolt. Most pilots would have bailed out, but Johnson didn't even consider it. He pointed the wounded aircraft west and began what would become one of the most harrowing returns of the war. Over Belgium, German fighters spotted the limping Thunderbolt. 3 separate times, FW-190s dove in to finish him off, and 3 times Johnson shoved the nose down, building speed despite damaged control surfaces and violent vibration. Even in its crippled state, the P-47D could still dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. Each time, his pursuers fell behind, unwilling to follow him into the transonic region where compressibility effects could kill an unwary pilot. By the time he crossed the English Channel, Johnson's aircraft was barely holding together. He descended gradually, engine coughing, oil and hydraulic fluid coating the windscreen, until forward visibility was nearly gone. Yet he guided the Thunderbolt with calm precision, setting it down at an emergency field in England in what witnesses later described as a flawless landing. When ground crews examined the aircraft, the extent of the damage left them speechless. Over 200 bullet and cannon holes perforated the fuselage and wings. The right wing had multiple longerons severed, compromising structural strength. Hydraulic systems were completely destroyed, and control surfaces were scarred and twisted. Even so, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine had kept running smoothly on 16 or 17 of its 18 cylinders, enough to get Johnson home. Amazingly, Johnson escaped with only minor shrapnel wounds, and incredibly, after extensive repairs, the very same P-47D returned to operational service. These October missions revealed something far more profound than any tactical lesson. The Thunderbolt was not just a weapon, it was a survivor. Its immense strength, redundant systems, and overbuilt engine gave pilots an unprecedented margin of safety. They could attack with ferocity, knowing that even if hit, they had a real chance of making it home. That confidence, multiplied across the 56th Fighter Group, became a decisive psychological weapon. By November 1943, the 56th Fighter Group's doctrine, forged by Zemke, Mahurin, Johnson, and others, had spread throughout the 8th Air Force. Every new P-47 unit learned the same creed. Think vertically, not horizontally. Altitude is life. Speed is survival. Discipline is victory. Never chase an enemy down to low altitude unless it's to save the bombers. Never turn with an enemy fighter when you can dive. Never fight fair attack with surprise, altitude, and overwhelming advantage. The results were staggering. From June through December 1943, as the tactics matured and combat experience deepened, the 56th Fighter Group achieved an air-to-air kill ratio approaching 11.1, counting only aircraft lost to enemy fighters. Even when including mechanical failures, flak, and weather losses, the group still maintained over a 5.1 overall ratio. In engagements where P-47 pilots maintained strict altitude discipline and followed the diving attack doctrine, the numbers became almost unbelievable. 15.1, sometimes even 20.1 in ideal circumstances. These results weren't luck or heroics. They were the inevitable consequence of physics, training, and machine design. The Thunderbolt was faster in a dive, more resilient under fire, and more forgiving in recovery than anything the Luftwaffe could field. The Germans could match courage with courage, skill with skill, but they could not outfight gravity, nor could they outlast steel. By the end of 1943, the lesson was written in contrails across the European sky. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had redefined air combat not through finesse, but through power, discipline, and unbreakable resolve. At 30,000 feet, a P-47 Thunderbolt sat perched on a mountain of potential energy, nearly 9.4 million foot-pounds of it. Every foot of altitude was stored power, waiting to be released. When a pilot pushed the nose over and dove through 20,000 feet, that potential energy converted into raw, blistering speed approaching or even exceeding 500 miles per hour. No German fighter could follow safely. The FW-190, formidable in a turn, was limited to around 450 Bond-indicated airspeed before its control surfaces began to tremble and its wings risked failure. The Bf-109, with its narrow wings and sensitive handling, fared little better. Its controls stiffened and compressibility effects set in early. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, thrived in the dive. A P-47 pilot could slash downward from 30,000 feet, fire a devastating burst at 20,000, and then pulling 4 to 5 Gs in the recovery zoom back up to 28,000 or 29,000 feet using the kinetic energy of the dive. The entire attack cycle, from roll in to climb out, took less than 90 seconds and consumed only a fraction of the fuel a German fighter would need to claw its way skyward. For the Luftwaffe, this disparity became a psychological wound that deepened with every engagement. By late 1943, German after-action reports began to include a telling refrain: avoid combat with P-47s above 25,000 feet. Some squadrons quietly refused to climb that high at all, focusing instead on attacking bombers during takeoff and return times when Thunderbolt escorts were absent or fuel limited. But those low-altitude attacks brought them straight into the defensive guns of the bombers, turning each pass into a deadly gamble. One of Germany's most experienced aces, Major Gunther Rall, who briefly commanded the 2nd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 11 in the spring of 1944, later explained the shift in German thinking. In post-war interviews, Rall recalled, "By late 43, we understood the P-47 was most dangerous when it had the height. The Americans had learned not to fight our way. They would not turn, they would not stay low. They attacked like hawks from above, unseen, too fast to follow. You looked up, saw a flash, and suddenly tracers filled your windscreen." When German fighters tried to climb to meet the Thunderbolts, the Americans simply climbed higher. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, with its turbo supercharger breathing freely at altitude, gave the P-47 power reserves no Daimler-Benz engine could match. The Luftwaffe's only partial countermeasure was to strike fast from below, hit the bombers, then dive away before the Thunderbolts could pounce. But those hurried attacks sacrificed accuracy and exposed the Germans to withering defensive fire. Rall himself survived the war with 275 confirmed victories, the 3rd highest score in history, yet even he acknowledged that the P-47 had shifted the balance of air combat in the West. The Thunderbolt's diving tactics, however, came with a cost that could not be measured in kill ratios. Pulling out of a 500 MEF dive subjected pilots to over 7 times the force of gravity. Blood drained from their heads, vision narrowed to a tunnel, and consciousness threatened to fade. Some blacked out entirely, regaining awareness only as the P-47's natural stability leveled it out. To survive, Thunderbolt pilots borrowed techniques from dive bomber crews. They tensed every muscle in their legs and abdomen, grunted or shouted to build chest pressure, and learned to limit recovery to 6 or 6.5 Gs, a balance between performance and survival. These anti-G techniques became second nature. The pilots' youth and fitness were their shields. Many returned from missions drenched in sweat, physically shaking from the effort. Over time, the strain accumulated spinal compression, chronic back pain, and temporary vision loss became occupational hazards of the 56th Fighter Group. Then came the brutal winter of 1943-44, and with it, the deep penetration raids that would test every lesson learned. On January 11, 1944, during the Oschersleben mission, the 56th Fighter Group faced its sternest trial yet. More than 100 German fighters rose to meet the bomber stream over central Germany. The engagement raged for nearly an hour across 150 miles of sky. At 29,000 feet, Major Francis Gabby Gabreski, now the group's operations officer, led the fight. He executed 6 separate diving attacks in a single engagement, destroying 3 enemy aircraft and damaging 2 more. In his combat report, Gabreski called it the most intense battle I have ever fought. The sky over Oschersleben was a violent, whirling chaos of contrails, cannon fire, and courage, thunderbolts screaming earthward in perfect dives, German fighters twisting to evade, and the endless roar of engines filling the frozen air. Thousands of gallons of fuel and thousands of rounds of ammunition burned away in that single hour. But when the smoke cleared, the lesson remained unmistakable. The P-47 Thunderbolt had turned gravity itself into a weapon, and the Luftwaffe could neither outfly it nor outlast it. The sky above Germany, February 1944, a battleground of thunder and steel. The 56th Fighter Group had just endured the ferocious Oschersleben mission, claiming 22 German fighters destroyed for the loss of 4 of their own. 3 Thunderbolts had fallen to enemy fire, 1 to mechanical failure. The kill ratio 5.5 to 1 was slightly below the group's blistering average. yet remarkable, given the scale and fury of the fight. But statistics tell only part of the story. What truly mattered was what didn't happen. During the window when the P-47s were overhead, only 5 B-17 bombers were shot down, astonishingly few compared to the heavy losses suffered whenever bomber formations flew without escort. The message was clear. Wherever the Thunderbolts roamed, the bombers lived to fight another day. Then came February 1944, and with it, Operation Argument, a campaign remembered simply as Big Week. 6 days, February 20th through 25th, of relentless daylight assaults on Germany's aircraft industry. The 8th Air Force hurled over 3,000 heavy bombers against targets deep inside the Reich. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had left. For the 56th, it was a test of endurance and precision. In just over a week, they flew 16 major missions, logging more combat hours than any other American fighter group in Europe. What had begun 9 months earlier as a tentative experiment in diving tactics had now evolved into a deadly art executed by pilots with hundreds of combat hours against increasingly desperate German opponents. The results were nothing short of catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Between Big Week and mid-March, the 56th destroyed approximately 87 enemy aircraft in the air, more than in any previous month. On February 20th, escorting bombers to Leipzig, they downed 15 German fighters without a single loss. 2 days later, on February 22nd, during the Halberstadt mission, they claimed 12 more. The effect was cumulative and devastating. Germany's air defense system, once a proud lethal shield, was beginning to crumble. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots were dying faster than new ones could be trained. Fresh replacements arrived at the front with barely 50 hours of flight time in their aircraft. Their American counterparts had 3 to 4 times that. These novices were easy prey. They failed to spot P-47s diving from above, misjudged their defensive turns, and too often panicked, diving away instinctively straight into the Thunderbolt's killing zone. By March 1944, air superiority over Germany had shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe still appeared, but in dwindling numbers, its attacks half-hearted and disorganized. On March 6th, when the 56th escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back, not a single German fighter dared engage them above 25,000 feet. The legend of the P-47 was no longer in doubt. Having conquered the air, the Thunderbolt soon turned its fury toward the ground. Fitted with 500 or 1,000-pound bombs and high-velocity aircraft rockets, it became a lethal fighter bomber, a role it performed with the same diving precision that had once terrified enemy aces. The method was the same. Orbit high above the battlefield at 25,000 feet or more, spot a target, a train yard, a convoy, a repair depot, then roll inverted, dive at 60 degrees, release weapons at 4,000 to 6,000 feet, and zoom back upward before flak gunners could track their trajectory. Gravity remained the Thunderbolt's most faithful ally. Among those who defined this new era was Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, the top American ace in the European theater. On July 5, 1944, he scored his 28th confirmed victory. Everyone achieved flying the indomitable P-47 Thunderbolt. But fate intervened just 15 days later. On July 20th, while strafing Bossenheim airfield at treetop level, Gabreski's propeller struck the ground. His Thunderbolt bucked, skidded, and crash-landed deep inside German territory. Captured, he would spend the remaining 9 months of the war as a prisoner. Years later, reflecting on his experiences, Gabreski credited Colonel Hubert Zemke's tactical doctrine with transforming doubt into dominance. When we arrived in England in January 1943, most of us thought the P-47 was too heavy, too clumsy. The British said we'd be slaughtered for weeks. It looked like they might be right until Zemke changed everything. We stopped trying to turn with German fighters. We started using what the Thunderbolt did best: altitude, speed, and strength. We attacked from above, hit hard, and climbed away before they could react. Suddenly, we weren't the underdogs anymore. The Jug had become our greatest weapon. Robert S. Johnson, another of the 56th Stars, closed out his combat tour with 27 confirmed victories and 91 missions, surpassing the World War I record of Eddie Rickenbacker. He was rotated home in May 1944, where he traded the cockpit for the podium-selling war bonds, training new pilots and telling wide-eyed audiences how a fighter once mocked as too heavy to fight had, through courage and innovation, become the indestructible giant of the skies. In his memoir, Thunderbolt, co-authored with Martin Caden, Robert S. Johnson placed discipline and adherence to tactical doctrine above all else. He stressed that while courage and piloting skill were essential, the proper application of tactics based on an aircraft's strengths and limitations was decisive. A mediocre pilot executing doctrine correctly could outperform a brilliant pilot who ignored it. In Johnson's view, victories were earned not just by reflex or daring, but by understanding and exploiting the physics, performance, and design of the P-47. The final statistics of the 56th Fighter Group offer compelling proof of this philosophy. Between April 1943 and April 1945, the unit flew 447 combat missions and claimed 674.5 confirmed aerial victories, more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force, according to U.S. Air Force Historical Study number 85. Losses to enemy fighters totaled 60 aircraft, producing an astonishing kill ratio of 11.2 to 1. When accounting for all operational losses, including mechanical failures, weather, and ground fire, the kill ratio remained a remarkable 5.3 to 1. These figures were not merely statistics. Each destroyed German fighter represented lives saved for bomber crews. Each protected bomber meant continued pressure on industrial targets, and every mission success contributed to the broader strategic bombing campaign that systematically eroded Germany's war-making capacity. The aces of the 56th Fighter Group achieved these remarkable tallies flying exclusively P-47 Thunderbolts. Francis Gabreski scored all 28 of his victories in the P-47. Robert Johnson tallied 27, while David Schilling recorded 22. 75 and Walker Mahurin achieved 21 before moving to other duties. Each of these pilots credited their success to the diving attack tactics pioneered by Colonel Hubert Zemke and refined through hundreds of combat sorties, a doctrine that turned the Thunderbolt's apparent weight and size into a strategic advantage. Across all theaters of the war, the P-47's performance validated this approach. The aircraft flew over 746,000 sorties, achieving an overall aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 while losing 3,499 aircraft in combat. This average, however, obscured significant variation. Units consistently employing high-altitude diving tactics achieved kill ratios between 8.1 and 15.1, while groups operating at low altitudes or deviating from doctrine saw much lower effectiveness. The Thunderbolt's success was no accident. It was the product of engineering genius at Republic Aviation, led by Alexander Kartveli. The P-47D variant, which equipped the majority of combat units, was a formidable machine. Wingspan, 40 feet 9 inches length, 36 feet 1 inch height, 14 feet 8 inches. Combat loaded weight, 14,000, 17 and 500 pounds, depending on external stores. Maximum speed, 433 mph at 30,000 feet. Rate of climb, 12,700 ftm at sea level, increasing at altitude thanks to turbocharger efficiency. Service ceiling, 42,000 feet. Combat radius with external tanks, 460 miles, sufficient for deep escort missions into central Germany. Its offensive armament 8, Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun, totaling 3,400 rounds, offered sustained fire for about 30 seconds of continuous firing. In combat, pilots fired in short bursts of 1 to 3 seconds, allowing ammunition to last for 10 to 15 separate engagements per mission. In short, the combination of engineering, disciplined tactics, and pilot skill transformed the P-47 from a skeptical curiosity into one of the most effective air superiority fighters of the war. A machine whose strength, firepower, and altitude advantage reshaped the air war over Europe and saved countless bomber crews in the process. The 50 caliber Browning round, each weighing roughly 1.7 ounces, with armor-piercing incendiary properties, was a devastating weapon. At ranges exceeding 500 yards, it could penetrate aluminum airframes, damage engines, rupture fuel tanks, and incapacitate pilots, turning the P-47's armament into a lethal instrument of precision. At the heart of the Thunderbolt roared the Pratt & Whitney R-2859 engine, displacing 2,804 cubic inches across 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9. At rated power, it produced 2,000 horsepower at 2,700 RPM, and when water methanol injection was engaged, so-called war emergency power output surged to 2,300 horsepower for up to 5 minutes. This immense energy spun a 4-blade Curtiss electric propeller, 12 feet 2 inches in diameter, whose tips at high speed approached sonic velocity, signaling pilots that they were nearing compressibility limits. The P-47's most sophisticated feature was its General Electric Type B-11 turbo supercharger, housed deep in the rear fuselage. Exhaust gases from all 18 cylinders spun a turbine at 21,300 RPM, driving a centrifugal compressor that pressurized incoming air to sea level equivalent density even at 30,000 feet. Passing through an intercooler to lower temperature and increase density, the compressed air entered the engine's supercharger for final compression. This 2-stage system enabled the R-2800 to maintain maximum rated power up to 27,000 feet, far above the limit of non-turbocharged fighters. Structurally, the Thunderbolt was a fortress. Its main wing spar withstood loads exceeding 8 GA positive and 3.5 GRA negative. Fuselage longerons and bulkheads were engineered to protect the pilot in even the most severe accidents. Armor was everywhere: a 69-pound headrest, a 1/4-inch plate behind the seat, 3 to 8-inch plating protecting engine accessories, and bulletproof windscreen panels. Self-sealing fuel tanks, constructed from rubber and fabric layers, would expand when punctured, preventing catastrophic fuel leaks. All these innovations combined to create an aircraft optimized for high-altitude, energy-based combat. The P-47 could climb to 30,000 feet, dive to strike from a position of overwhelming advantage at speeds no enemy could match, endure damage that would destroy lighter fighters, and zoom climb back to altitude for repeated strikes. This cycle could continue until fuel or ammunition were exhausted. For German pilots, facing such tactics posed impossible choices. Climb to meet the P-47 at high altitude, where American engines and turbochargers gave maximum advantage. Attempt to lure them down, where nimble German fighters excelled, or avoid engagement entirely, conceding air superiority. P-47 pilots refused to be baited, maintaining the vertical dimension as the battlefield where they ruled. The impact of these diving tactics extended far beyond individual dogfights. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace was critically weakened, in large part due to unsustainable losses inflicted by American fighters. Training programs could not replace experienced pilots fast enough, leaving fresh recruits with minimal flight hours vulnerable to disciplined P-47 tactics. Over time, this experience gap compounded as frontline American pilots accumulated substantially more combat hours than their German opponents. Combined with superior high-altitude performance and disciplined energy tactics, the Thunderbolt created an insurmountable advantage in the skies over Europe. This dominance directly enabled the strategic bombing campaign, allowing Allied bombers to systematically destroy oil production, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and transportation networks. The P-47's diving attacks from altitude were pivotal. Without air superiority, the bombing campaign could not have succeeded. The lessons of the P-47 endured long after the war. Post-war analysis confirmed that boom and zoom tactics, leveraging superior speed and energy management, were far more effective than traditional turning dogfights when facing equal opponents. This principle influenced jet fighter design and doctrine for decades. Fighters such as the F-86 Sabre, which triumphed in Korea, and its successor, the F-100 Super Sabre, emphasized speed, climb rate, and energy tactics over maneuverability in turn-in fights, proving that the Thunderbolt's lessons were truly timeless. Francis Gabreski carried the lessons of the P-47 into the jet age, flying F-86 Sabres in Korea with the same energy management principles he had mastered over Germany. In Korea, he shot down 6.5 MiG-15s, making him one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 different wars. The tactics that had worked against FW-190s and BF-109s, maintain altitude advantage, dive at high speed, deliver a precise burst, and zoom climb back to safety proved just as deadly against MiG-15s. The aircraft changed, the speeds increased, but the fundamental principles remained unshakably valid. German prisoners interviewed after the war consistently described P-47 diving attacks as among the most terrifying experiences of aerial combat. Oberleutnant Heinz Knucker, who surrendered in March 1945 after surviving years of combat and being shot down multiple times, told American intelligence officers that the Thunderbolt's psychological impact exceeded even its physical destructive power. "You would be climbing to engage the bombers," Knucker explained, "and suddenly your wingman would explode beside you. You would look up and see American fighters diving nearly vertically at impossible speeds. By the time you reacted, they were already pulling up and climbing away, untouchable. You could not catch them climbing. You could not evade them diving. You could only hope they would choose a different target next time." The physics of the diving attack remained unmatched throughout the era of propeller-driven fighters. Modern computer simulations, using authentic flight models and performance data, have confirmed what P-47 pilots learned the hard way. When Thunderbolts maintained altitude discipline and executed diving attacks exclusively, kill ratios often exceeded 20:1 against comparable German fighters. Conversely, when pilots abandoned doctrine and engaged in low-altitude turning fights, German fighters could achieve favorable exchanges. The lesson was clear. Tactics that leveraged real aircraft strengths always triumphed over wishful thinking about desired capabilities. The P-47 was not the most agile fighter. It did not excel at climbing below 20,000 feet, nor was it the longest range fighter in early variants. But it was the fastest diving fighter, the most survivable, and the most capable high-altitude performer. By building tactics around these true strengths, the 56th Fighter Group produced extraordinary results. Their achievement stands as one of the great tactical success stories of World War II. They took an aircraft widely dismissed as too heavy and cumbersome, identified its genuine advantages through careful testing and analysis, and developed tactics that maximize those advantages while minimizing weaknesses. Pilots trained relentlessly until the execution became instinctive, maintaining discipline under the most stressful combat conditions imaginable. The outcome was air superiority over Germany and the protection of thousands of bomber crews who could complete their missions thanks to Thunderbolts diving from above. Colonel Hubert Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group during this transformative period and established the tactical doctrine that made it successful, reflected in his memoir, "When I took command in September 1942, I had an aircraft that everyone said was wrong for the mission, and pilots who were terrified they would be slaughtered by experienced German pilots. I had to find what the P-47 could do well and build tactics around those capabilities. The dive became everything. We could dive faster than anyone. We could recover from dives that would kill other pilots. We could zoom, climb back to altitude, and do it again. Once we mastered this, we became unstoppable." By the end of the war, the P-47 had proven itself as one of the most effective fighter aircraft in history. Its overall record 746,000 sorties with a 4.6.1 kill ratio reflected not just raw numbers, but the careful exploitation of engineering excellence, tactical innovation, and disciplined execution that had turned the Thunderbolt into a legend of the skies. Yet, beneath these broad statistics lay the true measure of the P-47's extraordinary capability, revealed by units that rigorously followed doctrine. The 56th Fighter Group's kill ratio 11.1 for air-to-air losses alone, 5.3.1, including all operational losses, demonstrated the heights achievable when tactics, discipline, and analysis converged. Within that framework, individual pilots reached astonishing levels of success. Gabreski claimed 28 victories in 166 missions, Johnson 27 in just 91 missions, and Schilling 22 3/4 in 132 missions, averaging nearly 1 kill every 4 sorties. These rates exceeded what most air forces considered sustainable or even possible over extended campaigns. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt and its diving tactics is ultimately a story of logic triumphing over assumption, discipline prevailing over improvisation, and physics overruling tradition. In early 1943, every expert believed that heavy fighters could not compete with nimble, light aircraft. Conventional wisdom shaped, since the First World War emphasized turning ability, climb rate, and maneuverability. And pilots instinctively sought light, responsive aircraft for twisting dogfights. Then came a group of American pilots under Hubert Zemke, climbing to 30,000 feet in the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built, rolling inverted, pushing the stick forward, and discovering that every assumption was wrong. They found that plunging straight down at 500 miles per hour was the fastest path to victory, and that the zoom climb back to altitude was the most effective defensive maneuver ever conceived. they demonstrated that an aircraft's true capability mattered infinitely more than conventional wisdom about what fighters should do. The Germans who faced these attacks never forgot the lesson. The Americans who executed them never doubted their effectiveness. And historians studying the triumph of the Thunderbolt must see the lesson clearly. A supposedly inferior fighter can dominate when tactics exploit unexpected strengths. The P-47 pilots began diving straight down because analysis showed it was optimal. They continued because combat confirmed the theory. They achieved kill ratios approaching 20-1 in ideal conditions because physics and disciplined tactics outweighed raw courage and tradition. That is how air superiority is won. That is how bomber streams were protected. That is how pilots returned home alive against experienced enemies. The formula was simple, yet exacting. Identify the aircraft's true strengths through rigorous analysis. Develop tactics that exploit those strengths while minimizing weaknesses. Train relentlessly until execution is instinctive. Maintain discipline, even when instinct screams to abandon doctrine. Then at 30,000 feet, roll inverted, point the nose toward the earth, accelerate to 500 miles per hour, fire a precise burst, and pull back firmly to zoom climb before anyone can respond. Execute it with discipline, with mutual support, and no enemy pilot in the sky can touch you. This was the secret of the 56th Fighter Group A tactical revolution forged through months of analysis, training, and combat experience. It changed aerial warfare, secured air superiority over Germany, and defined why the P-47 began diving straight down. It was not simply courage. Though courage was required, it was not solely the aircraft. Though the Thunderbolt possessed formidable advantages, it was superior tactics, rigorously grounded in physics and executed with unwavering discipline. That combination proved unstoppable.